Morning, everyone. My name is Barb Harrison, and I am a Buncombe County Master Gardener volunteer. I will be your host today. I want to welcome you to our Saturday seminar series titled Gardening in Small Spaces. Today's presentation is Growing and Preserving Culinary Herbs, presented by Extension Master Gardener Phil Roudebush. Phil has gardened for many years in Mississippi and in Kansas, and now here in Buncombe County. He typically grows about 30 different herbs in his personal garden. He's helped develop several educational herb demonstration gardens. Phil is a retired veterinarian, a researcher, and a Buncombe County gardener volunteer. He's a very clever and creative gardener. So please welcome Phil Roudebush and learn about growing and using culinary herbs for small garden spaces. Take it away, Phil.
Thanks, Barb, and welcome to everybody to a discussion of growing and using culinary herbs. September is really my favorite month when it comes to growing herbs because you've nurtured the plants all summer. You're now ready to prepare them to enjoy for the next 6 to 9 months. In the past month alone, I've made 6 different kinds of herb pestos, including basil, lemon, cilantro, mixed herb, shiso, and a Southeast Asian pesto. Bottled tarragon vinegar, dried marjoram and tarragon on my back porch, made lavender and scented geranium infused sugar, and I have a box of tomatoes in the kitchen that I'm going to can tomorrow that will include a fresh herb mixture of oregano, basil, rosemary, and thyme in each jar. So it's a great time of year to be gardening, and let's get started talking about herbs. In your handout and notes, there are several different resources that are listed. These are 2 of my favorites. My favorite kind of general herb reference is Rodale's Illustrated Encyclopedia of Herbs. This is an excellent encyclopedia that contains information about individual herbs and about growing and preserving herbs in general. And the other reference I like, if you're also interested in spices, is the book Herbs and Spices, The Cook's Reference by Jill Norman. I will show her book again here in a few minutes. It's about half information about herbs and the other half is about spices. So if you're interested in information about both of those, it's excellent, and it's also beautifully illustrated. The third source that I think is excellent is the Herb Society of America has a wonderful website, herbsociety.org. And has not only information about the Herb Society and its activities, but also has a wealth of information about individual herbs. An herb like basil, I think there's about 30 or 35 pages of information about basil, what it is, how to grow it, and recipes about using it. Some of the recipes that I'll mention later actually come from the Herb Society website. There's a link to the handout or notes that accompany this presentation. It's about 20 pages long. I've been working on this and refining it over the last 10 years and has quite a bit of information, much more information than I'll cover in this presentation about not only individual herbs, but lots of different recipes for pestos and other ways to preserve herbs. I would recommend that you get that handout link and print it off at some point. What is an herb? Well, it kind of depends on who you ask. If you ask a botanist to define an herb, they're going to give you this definition. An herb is any non-woody flowering plant. That comes from the Latin word herba, which means grass. So grasses are all non-woody flowering plants, and they would be considered by a botanist to be an herb. Our wildflowers are non-woody flowering plants, and they would be considered by a botanist to be an herb as well. But for this presentation, we're going to define an herb as any plant with leaves, stems, or flowers that's used for flavoring food, drink, medicine, or perfume. We're going to focus today on food and flavoring in the culinary herbs. We also use it to describe the part of such a plant that's used in cooking. How do you pronounce herb? Do you pronounce it with the H or without? That's an age-old question. Certainly if you talk to somebody who speaks American English, we typically don't use the H. If you talk to somebody who's British, they're going to use the H. So either herb or herb are both acceptable ways to pronounce the word. In general, today we're going to be talking about those parts of the plant that are green and leafy. In some case, they may be bronze or purple color. We're going to be talking about some flowering herbs as well. Versus a spice. A spice, by my definition, are going to be seeds, berries, bark, root, or dried fruit. We're going to be talking about several plants where we use it as an herb, and then we may use its seeds, berries, or dried fruit as a spice. The two that are shown here is coriander on the left, which we can use the green leafy part of the plant is either leaf coriander or cilantro. And then those are fennel seeds, and we can use the leaf fennel as an herb, and we use the seed as a spice. We're not going to cover cultivation a lot other than to give you some cultivation tips. Since we're focused on culinary herbs, I usually recommend that if you have an herb garden for culinary purposes, that you put it near your kitchen. You're more likely to go out and pick the herbs and use them if it's near the kitchen. In general, herbs are relatively disease resistant compared to many other vegetable crops and even ornamental plants. We're going to talk about a few pests and diseases that do affect herbs, but in general, they're a good place for a gardener to begin. There's a chart in the notes about the sun requirements. Many of the herbs that we use are Mediterranean in origin. In other words, they originated in the Mediterranean basin. And of course, that's relatively warm and dry compared to our environment here in North Carolina and maybe where you garden. But in general, many of these that are perennials, once they get established, because their origins are from a relatively drier environment, they can be very resistant to drought conditions. Many of the herbs are amendable to growing in pots. I live in a townhome now, so most of the herbs that I have are either on pots or containers and some in my landscape beds. We'll talk about several of the herbs that I consider to be an edible ground cover. So they make a very nice ground cover. And then many of them are also pollinator insect friendly. Well, the North Carolina Extension Gardener Handbook has an excellent table on the sun and shade requirements of most of the major herbs. They also talk about the watering requirements and fertilization. That table I've reproduced in the notes, so I would refer that to you, especially from a water requirement standpoint, because as I said, many of these originated in the Mediterranean basin, in the eastern Mediterranean area. That's relatively dry. Oftentimes we have a tendency to overwater the herbs. So just look at that chart and be sure that you give the appropriate moisture. And same thing with fertilization. Most of the herbs don't require intense fertilization, but that varies with the herbs. So again, refer to the table in the Extension Gardener Handbook, which is available online, or look at the chart that's in the notes.
There are some questions, Phil. One of them is, do you do anything to the beds where you're growing your herbs to help them overwinter?
Good question. Depends on the herb. Once you get, let's say rosemary is very hardy once it gets established. I don't do anything with that, but most of the times, other than routinely mulching around the plant, I don't do anything beyond that.
Another question is about soil. What are the best soil amendments for herbs?
The best soil amendments for herbs are going to be as you would use for any ornamental plants. Here in North Carolina, we have heavy clay soils, and so we primarily want to amend with some type of organic matter, either compost, pine bark, leaves, or leaf mold. Just incorporate that organic matter either around the plant if it's established or into the bed before you plant initially.
And also, if you're growing herbs in raised beds, do you need to cover them in the winter time to protect them?
Depends on the herb. So if you're talking about a woody herb like rosemary, you're just going to want to mulch around the base of that. Otherwise, yes, you can go ahead and let the herb in particular die back and then lightly mulch over the top of that. Herbs are fairly resistant to many pests and diseases and are good for beginning gardeners to start with. There are some arthropods, including insects and mites, that are ubiquitous, not only on herbs, but in many other plants. So leafhoppers, aphids, whiteflies, thrips, and spider mites are all commonly found on many different plants, including herbs. We won't have time today to really talk about these insect or arthropod pests in general, but refer you to other references. And the same thing is true for the fungal diseases. Gray mold, also called botrytis blight, powdery mildew, and rust are all ubiquitous fungal diseases. I wanted to show pictures of them on non-herbal plants just to show you that they're fairly common and they can spread from other plants to the herbs. Again, the handout lists some of the more common or key pests or diseases. We won't cover those today, but you can find other sources to not only identify them, but talk about preventing and treating those. We're going to spend most of today talking about a variety of herbs, mainly for culinary use. We're going to be talking about more than 30 different herbs. The way I've organized this is based on how Jill Norman organizes herbs in her book, Herbs and Spices. I think this is a good way to think about them when you're using them in the kitchen. What is the dominant aroma and flavor? So we're going to talk about each of these. We're not going to be able to spend a lot of time on each individual herb, kind of highlight what I think are some of the more important aspects. There are more detailed information in the handout or notes about each of the herbs. And certainly the references that I mentioned, the Rodale Encyclopedia and the Herb Society website and Jill Norman's book are all places to go for more detailed information. We're going to start with the first group of herbs, which are the fresh and mild herbs. The first one we'll talk about is parsley. I always start with parsley because this was my mother's favorite herb. She used parsley in everything, in cooking and as a garnishment. So as a young child, I thought parsley was about the only herb that actually existed. It's a biennial herbaceous plant. It's native to the central Mediterranean area. Because it's a biennial and it's in the carrot family, it puts up the foliage for the first year and then puts all that nutrients down into the taproot, which actually looks a lot like a carrot and has sort of a carrot type of flavor. We really harvest the leaves the first year. If you are in a climate where the parsley overwinters, many times it will die out, but if it overwinters, then the next spring, it'll put up a flower stalk, go to seed, and then die very quickly. So we really don't want to use it the second year. So in essence, it's a biennial plant that we grow as an annual. There are two main groups of parsley, the curly leaf and Italian or flat leaf. The curly leaf is the one I remember from my childhood. It was fairly common in the 1950s and 60s, but over the last 20 or 30 years, the flat leaf, or sometimes called Neapolitan or Italian leaf parsley, has become more common, primarily because it's more tolerant to weather extremes and it does have a little bit stronger flavor. It's the base for many of the pestos that we'll mention later. One of my favorite herbs is borage, one that many people are not familiar with. It's an annual herb that's known as the star flower because it produces these beautiful blue flowers that are edible. It's sometimes called the herb of gladness or the herb of courage. You see the quote there from about 300 or 400 years ago. Those of our time do use the flowers in salads to exhilarate and make the mind glad. And there may be a physiological basis for that. Borage is now grown as a seed oil crop, and it's very high in a fatty acid named gamma-linolenic acid, which is in high concentrations in the brain. So that fatty acid may have some beneficial effects on brain function, hence its herb of gladness or herb of courage. It has a very nice cucumber-like flavor. It's an example of an herb that has an unacceptable flavor when it's dried or frozen, so it should be used fresh. One use of the flowers is if you have a traditional ice cube tray, you can float the flowers in the water when you make the ice cube, and then you'll pop those out and you'll have an ice cube with a beautiful blue flower in it that you can use in drinks for entertainment. Shiso is a culinary herb. Sometimes the seed is used as a spice, used in Japan and China and other parts of Asia. Generally comes as either a purple or a green variety. The red or purple type is a little bit less aromatic and has a little bit more subtle flavors. It's primarily used to hold food or garnish food. So you can, in Japan, take sashimi or sushi and present it on a shiso leaf, and the leaf can be consumed with the food. It has a very unique flavor. It's in the mint family, So it can be a little bit aggressive in the garden in that it will spread. Oftentimes, if you allow it to go to flower and seed, it will spread within the garden. But a very ubiquitous flavor. Here's another example. In Japan, you can find Shiso flavored Pepsi. In the notes or handout, there is a recipe for making Shiso pesto. It's really a good accompaniment to fish and seafood. The final fresh and mild herb we'll talk about is new to me. I try to grow something new every couple of years, and this is the first year that I've grown salad Burnet. It's an evergreen perennial. This is the first time I've grown it. It's done well this summer, and we'll see if it overwinters. You use the fresh leaves or stems. It has a unique nutty cucumber-like aroma and flavor. You use the fresh leaves and stems, as I said, and as its name suggests, it's good to use in salads or use it anywhere you would use parsley. It gives you a little bit different flavor and aroma profile than parsley, but use it similar to parsley. It's one that I look forward to understanding a little bit better and using more broadly in the kitchen. So let me stop there. We've talked about parsley, borage, shiso, and salad Burnet. Next, we're going to talk about sweet herbs. Everybody loves to talk about and grow and use basil. There are over 150 different cultivars of sweet basil or other basil species that are available. So a wide variety of basil. It is native to India, Sri Lanka, and other tropical areas of Asia. So it's very cold intolerant. In fact, it got down in the low 40s the last couple of nights, and my basil really was affected by that. And once it gets below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, basil usually gives up. There's several general categories of basil: Genovese or Italian basil, Asian or thyme basil. And then one I also like is called fine leaf, sometimes called globe basil. I like it because you can trim it with a pair of scissors. It's already pre-chopped. It makes a very nice globe shape, and it's actually a very nice basil to grow in containers. You do want to remove the flower buds or flowers to encourage more leaf growth. Dried basil has very little flavor, so if you're going to use it, either use it in pestos, or you can blanch the leaves briefly in boiling water and then freeze them for use later. Basil is one of the more disease prevalent herbs that we grow. One of the newest ones that we have here in the eastern United States is called basil downy mildew. Now, this is different than the powdery mildew that I talked about earlier. This is very similar to the organism that causes late blight in tomatoes, which can be a very devastating disease. And this was first reported in 2006. It lives in warmer climates like Florida and the Gulf Coast, and it's wind dispersed with abundant spores, so it will move north during the summer. This year, several of the hurricanes that we had that came up across Florida and the South probably brought many of those spores. So once a basil becomes infected with this, there's nothing you can do, and you really need to remove the plant and destroy the plant material. But on the good side, there are now some downy mildew resistant varieties that have been bred and are now available. So again, this is not a disease that we have every year, but if the spores come up from the south late in the year, it can be a very devastating disease for basil.
There was another question about basil, two questions about basil. One question is, my basil gets bitter in July when it starts to flower. Do you have any suggestions about how to remedy that?
The best thing there is to remove the flowers. So that will not only help enhance the flavor of the basil, but will encourage the plant to make more leaves. That's the best thing you can do, is just remove the flowers as soon as you see them.
And one more about holy basil. Is that considered a perennial, and is it hardy?
I am not familiar with that. So I don't know the origin. If it comes from the same place where most of the other basil cultivars come from, it's not going to be winter hardy, but I'm not familiar with that specifically. Lavender, there are a number of different species, cultivars, and hybrids of lavender. I always grew lavender primarily for its beauty and for its aroma and fragrance. And my wife and I, a number of years ago, were at a nice restaurant where the dessert was lavender scones and lavender flavored ice cream. We really enjoyed that, and it really opened my thought to using lavender for culinary purposes. Then ran across this cookbook called the Lavender Cookbook by Sharon Shipley. If you're interested in cooking with lavender, this is a good place to begin. One of the things that Sharon Shipley said in her book is that the various cultivars and hybrids, there are several that are really best to use for culinary purposes, not just for its aroma. I was chagrined to find out that the original lavender I planted at my previous house, I had no idea what cultivar or hybrid it was. So when we moved here, I planted one called Provence. So Hidcote, Provence, and Munsteed are cultivars or hybrids of lavender that are the types of oils that they have are very good for culinary purposes. So if you want to use it for culinary purposes, be sure to know what cultivar or hybrid you're using, and I would point you to Sharon Shipley's book. One of the ways that you can use lavender is make lavender infused sugar. I've done that over the last 4 to 6 weeks. Just take lavender flowers and layer that with sugar in a container, leave it for about 4 to 6 weeks, and then you can strain out the lavender, and you'll just have the lavender scented sugar that you can use for cooking purposes. I will tell you that if you use fresh flowers, the amount of moisture in the flowers will cause the sugar to clump, so you may want to dry it first before you infuse the sugar. So I've got some lavender infused sugar that I look forward to using in cooking later this year. The bay leaf was the other herb that my mother used all the time in stews and soups. I have grown bay in the past, the bay tree. One of the challenges with it is that the bay leaves can be a little bit bitter if you pick a leaf and use it right away. So you need to think ahead, and if you're going to use a bay leaf, it's probably best to pick it and let it dry for about 3 to 5 days before using it. It will grow in a temperate climate in an area that is protected from the weather, or you can grow it in a container and bring it indoors in the wintertime. Scented geranium is not a true geranium. It's in the Pelargonium genus, and it comes from the Greek word paragos, which means stork. You can see the picture here of the seed head. It kind of looks like a stork's head and bill. So it's really a Pelargonium. It's native to South Africa, so it doesn't overwinter in the climates that we have here in North Carolina, but one that you grow annually. It comes in dozens and dozens of different scents and flavors, including chocolate and lime and mint and citrus and rose, etc. Around here, if you buy it at a garden center, you're going to find that most of these are a citrus variety, but you can buy others from garden stores online that have different flavors. Again, this is the rose scented geranium and the citrus scented geranium you can use to make a scented geranium infused sugar. I've done that this year. Kind of the same thing as I mentioned with lavender. If you use the fresh leaf, it'll cause the sugar to clump. So you may want the leaves to dry out a little bit before you make that. I've got some citrus scented geranium sugar to use in baking later this year as well. Another one that I just started growing for the first time about 3 or 4 years ago is called sweet woodruff. It is one of the herbs that prefers either partial shade or full shade. I'm really growing it as a ground cover and not using it much from a culinary aspect. The one culinary use is to make what's called German May wine. I remember my mother making this when I was a child, taking a base white wine and adding fresh fruit or sweet woodruff as an herb. This is one herb where the aromas are actually enhanced by picking or drying. Many of the herbs that we're going to talk about may lose their aromas with drying, but this is one where it's actually enhanced because of that. It has new mown hay and vanilla fragrances. Again, they become more intense with drying, so it's useful in potpourris, perfumes, sachets for linen drawers. So again, as its name says here, odoratum, it's used more for its aroma than it is for culinary uses.
One question, is sweet woodruff deer resistant?
Good question. We certainly have pretty high deer pressure in my neighborhood where I live, and I grow it in a landscape bed, and it has not been nibbled on by deer at all. So I don't know specifically. It's usually not listed among the herbs that are deer resistant, but I certainly have not had any problems with the deer. So those are the sweet herbs: basil, lavender, scented geranium, bay leaf, and sweet woodruff. Next, we're going to move on to the citrus or tart herbs. The first one we'll talk about is lemon balm. I want you to focus on the Latin name because it helps you understand a little bit about the plant. The Latin name is Melissa officinalis. Lemon balm is in the mint family. Any of the herbs that have balm as part of the common name, in this case, lemon balm, or is sometimes called English balm, garden balm, balm mint, will tell you that it's in the mint family. And I like this description. It's like a Meyer lemon in herbal form. I like to make a lemon pesto each year, and the lemon pesto, one of the herbs that I use is lemon balm. So a little bit about the Latin name, because I think it tells you quite a bit about this particular herb. It comes from two Greek and Latin words. Melissa is the Greek word for honeybee. So that tells you that this is an herb that is definitely pollinator friendly or bee friendly, because when this particular herb was given its Latin name a couple hundred years ago, it was known to attract honeybees. The other Latin name that I want you to look at, not only for this herb, but a number of the different herbs that we're going to talk about today, is officinalis. You may see officinalis, or you may see officinale, Officinale. Those are Latin words meaning used in medicine. The officina was the storeroom in the monastery for herbs and medicines. So when these herbs were given their Latin name, if you see officinalis or officinale, then you know that it was originally used for medicinal purposes. The other interesting thing about lemon balm, and one reason it is known to attract honeybees, is the honeybee produces what is called Nazanov's pheromone. So as the bee is feeding on a pollinator crop, it will release this pheromone. The active ingredients in that are a couple of compounds called citrol and geraniol. It will release that pheromone, and when they fly back to the hive, we'll leave that pheromone behind and along the way, and other bees will know to go to that plant. Well, it's fascinating that the lemon balm releases these same two compounds that mimic this Nazanov's pheromone released by honeybees. That's why bees and other insects are attracted to it. So really relates very nicely to its Latinized scientific name.
Just one question, Phil. Question is, how hard is lemon balm here in Western North Carolina?
Lemon balm here is actually pretty hardy. If you put it in a nice protected spot, it is one that sometimes prefers partial shade. But if you put it in a protected spot, it generally will survive the winter and come back. If you want to mulch over the top of it, you can. I usually don't. Lemongrass is native to Southeast Asia, so warmer climates here in North Carolina. Sometimes it will overwinter and sometimes it will not. It's related to citronella grass and has very nice lemon or citrus odors that will persist a long time. So even if the lemongrass dies, if you come back to clear it the next year or the next spring, you're going to find that the aromas are still very intense. It's used primarily, traditionally, at least in Asian cooking. The Southeast Asian pesto recipe, and one that I made earlier this year, does use lemongrass. The other herb with lemon in its name is lemon verbena, sometimes called lemon bee brush or lemon bee bush. This is native to South America, primarily Argentina. So a more temperate climate, but usually even here in North Carolina, in a protected spot, will overwinter. What I like about lemon verbena is it grows normally as a shrub, so it will sometimes get 6 to 8 feet tall. But what I like about it is the leaves have sort of a waxy coating on them, so they have a very intense lemon or citrus aroma and flavor. And when you dry those, that waxy coating on the leaves, those aromas and flavors will persist for months and months and months. So if you put it in a Ziploc bag or some other closed container, it will retain that lemon aroma and flavor. And when I make the lemon pesto, I usually like to make it with about 50% lemon verbena and about 50% lemon balm. The final one we'll talk about is sorrel. It is both available as a garden sorrel and French sorrel, very similarly related. I like really sharp, sour flavors, and so I really like sorrel. That sharp tang comes from oxalic acid in the leaves. This quote from several hundred years ago, so grateful of quickness to the salad that it should never be left out. So it can be chopped up and used in salads. There are recipes for sorrel soups, and anywhere where you want a little bit of a sour flavor. It is very much a cool weather herb. So it's a perennial first herb that comes up in the spring. So this year it saw sorrel come out of the ground for the first time in late February. And it will actively grow until it starts getting hot in June. Then in July and August, it pretty much doesn't die back, but it really kind of quits growing. And right about now, when it's starting to get cool again, it's really looking pretty. So it is kind of a spring and a fall herb. But anywhere you want sour flavor, it's a good herb to use. Okay, we're going to move on to licorice or anise herbs. The first one is chervil, sometimes called French or gourmet's parsley. This is one that I've had a difficult time growing here. I've had most success using it in a container where I keep it on my front porch, where it can be in either partial shade or full shade. It is not real hardy though, it's fairly delicate. And even this year had a beautiful chervil plant until about the 1st of July, and then it just very quickly gave up and died. So it's one I've had a difficult time growing, but certainly it's one that you can use in place of parsley where you want that mild anise flavor. Tarragon, I like this description. It has the constitution of a prairie weed once it gets established. This year I grew it in a container on my deck, and it was like the picture on the left. It was young and flexible and nice leaves. If you put it in a spot where it's happy, it will grow quite large. I've had tarragon that's gotten as high as 3 or 4 feet tall and will actually develop very woody stems. The nice thing about that is late in the year, if you get the tarragon that has these woody stems, you can cut it off at the ground, sharpen one end, and use that as a shish kebab. So you can take meat or vegetables and put it directly on that woody tarragon stem and put that on the grill and use it like that. Tarragon is also really good to use in flavored oils or vinegars. Dill we use both as an herb and as a spice. So we use the dill, so-called dill weed, which is off the plant. If you harvest dill weed, as we do on many of the other leaves, don't harvest more than about 1/3 of the leaves at any one time so that you retain some of the leaf structure for the plant to continue to grow. And then you can use the flowering heads. If you make dill pickles or in cooking, you can use the dill flowering heads and then let it go to seed and use dill seed. So we use it as both an herb and a spice.
Phil, somebody asked if you could give some tips on growing dill. I've had issues with dill. Sometimes it just dies. So if you have any tips, that would be great.
I don't have any tips because when I lived in Kansas, I had no problems growing dill. And I lived there for about 25 years and had herbs for a number of that time. But here I've had a difficult time as well. A lot of it is what's called fine leaf dill, and I just don't think it's as hardy a variety. So I have not had as good a success here as I have had elsewhere with dill. And I don't know if it's the variety of the dill or whether from an environmental standpoint, we just aren't in a good dill growing area. So I don't have any good tips, and I'm not real sure I have figured out how to grow good dill here either. I will say that dill, when I've grown it and it's gone to seed and it's self-seeded, is that the self-seeding dill that's come up the next year has actually been a little bit hardier than the original plant that I planted. So I don't have any good tips, and I'm not sure I've figured out the dill secret here.
I would agree with that. And somebody in the chat box stated not to overwater dill.
That's a really good tip. And in fact, that's true for many of the herbs. So look at the chart that gives the water requirements for each of the herbs. I think that's a good point. And I think we have a tendency to overwater not only dill, but many of the other ones as well. Remember, a lot of these originated in the Mediterranean basin, and it's relatively warm and dry there. again, the moisture levels, both naturally and watering, may be detrimental. Fennel, a couple of different varieties of fennel. There's what's called sweet fennel or wild fennel, where we use the leaves. The most common variety we have around here is bronze fennel. Has a very strong licorice aroma and flavor. You can also get varieties of fennel that are so-called Florence fennel or vegetable or bulb fennel, where we use the expanded bulb or stem as a vegetable. Fennel frequently attracts what's called the parsley worm. And this is where it's good to know about the different families of herbs. There are a number of the herbs that are in the carrot family, including parsley that we mentioned. Dill is in the carrot family, as well as fennel. The parsley worm is not a worm, but it's the caterpillar of the black swallowtail butterfly. It's attracted to any of the herbs that are in the carrot family. But in my experiences, most commonly, they're attracted, and you'll see the caterpillars on fennel, but it can occur on dill, parsley, or any of the other herbs in the carrot family. Minty herbs, there are a variety of different mints. We'll talk about spearmint and peppermint, which are probably those varieties which are most commonly used. Pliny the Elder is one of my heroes. 2,000 years ago, he described mint very well. He said, once planted, it lasts a considerable length of time. So we know that mint in general, and really any of the herbs in the mint family, can be very aggressive at spreading either locally within your garden or elsewhere on the property. Oniony herbs, garlic is an herb. We can think of the cloves as a spice as well. It's probably the herb that we have to have the most patience with. So it has about a 9-month gestation periods. Here in North Carolina, we're going to plant garlic in October up to maybe as late as Thanksgiving. So October and early November. Then in March and April, it's going to come up as what we call green garlic, and we can harvest it then. And if you pull it, it's going to have a bulb that looks like a single bulb, sort of like an onion. Then if it's a hardneck garlic, it will put up a scape or a flowering stalk, and that's the hard garlics. They will form at the end of that bulbules. All parts of the garlic are edible. So the leaves are edible, the scape is edible, the bulbules are edible. But if we want to produce those cloves of garlic, we want to let it go until mid to late summer. Then when the leaves have died down, harvest it. We've seen in the tailgate markets here in North Carolina, in the April-May timeframe, you're going to see a lot of garlic scapes for sale. I've got a garlic scape pesto recipe in the handout.
Another question is, what is the best garlic to grow? I guess that would be either a soft neck or hard neck.
The best garlic to grow really depends. Again, there's such a wide variety. Don't use garlic from the grocery store, because a lot of that comes from Asia and you don't know whether it's carrying a disease or what variety. My recommendation is go to farmers markets or tailgate markets, talk to the people. Right now, there's lots of garlic in the farmers and tailgate markets, and talk to those individuals about where they grow and where they get the material. You can certainly do that from online garden centers or garden catalogs as well. But there's such a wide variety that you just need to start with, do I want a hard neck or soft neck, and go from there. Chives are the other member of the onion family that we use commonly as an herb. There's the traditional chive, and then the tuberosum, which is the garlic chive. If you like to have a mild garlic aroma in flavor, the garlic chive is very good. The greenery is a little bit flatter and easier to deal with.
One question about chives. Any ideas on how to deal with thrips on chives, which is a big problem?
Yeah, thrips are a big problem. I have not particularly had problems with chives, so just need to read up about thrips in general. It's such a generalist insect pest that it's probably coming in from other plants. You can use sticky traps. You can buy these sticky pads that you can put next to it, and the thrips will stick to it. It's sort of like sticky tape that you would get for houseflies. I think that's one of the best things. I certainly can use that around houseplants, but I think you could use that around your chives as well.
That's it, Bill. Thank you.
So we talked about the licorice or anise herbs. We talked about a couple of the minty herbs and the oniony herbs. Bitter astringent herbs. So the one I'll mention is Lovage. And again, you can see the name officinale. So again, that tells you that when it was named, it was originally thought to have medicinal purposes. This can, in a happy place, this can get actually 6 feet tall. It looks like a celery plant that didn't know when to stop growing. The leaves look like a celery leaf, and they actually taste like celery, but they're a little more bitter or astringent than celery. So I made the mistake early on of trying to use it equal amounts to what I would use with celery in a recipe, and it turned out to be too bitter. So if you want a slight celery flavor, you don't want to use a lot of it, Lovage is a nice herb, and it's a beautiful plant to grow just in a bed. And in the notes, I have a recipe for making Lovage simple syrup. So it's pretty simple. You take a cup of sugar and a cup of water and bring it to a boil, take it off the heat, put in about a cup of fresh Lovage leaves, let it sit there for about 4 or 5 hours, and then strain out the leaves. You have a Lovage simple syrup. I've got in the notes a recipe. You can use that in Prosecco. You can use that in a gin and tonic or another mixed drink. And so that's kind of a fun way to use Lovage in a different way. Pungent or spicy herbs. Oregano is very commonly used. It's one that I find people don't recognize when it's growing in the landscape. It's a great one for what I call an edible cover crop. If you use a low growing oregano variety, it will make a very nice cover crop in your bed that virtually no weeds or anything else will grow up through it. It comes from 2 Greek words meaning joy of the mountain. It tells you that they originated in the mountains in Greece, so it's a Mediterranean herb. Sometimes you'll hear it described as wild marjoram, although it's different than the marjoram we'll talk about next. You'll also see the term pot marjoram. Sometimes that's used for this oregano and other oregano species. Marjoram is basically a first cousin to oregano. Again, it's in the Oreganum genus. Very, very powerful odor. I like this quote: in all odoriferous waters and powders that are for beauty and delight. So both the leaves and the flowers can be used in bath waters. Their essential oils are used wherever you want a strong fragrance or aroma. Rosemary, again, you can see officinalis, so it's thought to have medicinal properties. Rosmarinus means dew of the sea. Again, this is a native of the Mediterranean basis. It's one that's very drought tolerant, also very deer tolerant, drought tolerant to the point that the name dew of the sea comes from the fact that sometimes the only moisture it needs is the dew in the morning that accumulates on the leaves and then drops off into the soil. So again, this is a plant that is very drought tolerant and should not be overwatered.
There was just some comments about growing rosemary, whether it was better to grow it in a pot. Can you grow it in a raised bed? Can you grow it in the ground?
I have not grown rosemary in a container or a raised bed. I've always just grown it in the ground. It should do well in any of those locations. So once you get established, it's pretty hardy. If you grow it in a container, if it gets real cold, you may have problems. You may want to put it in a protected area because you may get freezing through the pot. So at least my experience, it does really well in the ground. Sage, salvia, means to save or heal. Again, officinalis tells you that it originally thought to have a wide variety of medicinal purposes. I like the variegated or kind of the multicolored sage, and this sage is one that when it's dried, it retains the aromas and flavors for a very long period of time. Savory comes in 2 forms, summer savory and winter savory. Winter savory is a perennial in our environment, so it's sort of woody, and once it gets established, persists for a long time. Summer savory is considered to be an annual. Its flavors are a little bit milder. So from a cooking standpoint, it's also very good where you want more delicate flavors, whereas the winter savory is better if you're going to use it in a stew or that type of thing. And as its name suggests, kind of savory recipes is where those are both used. I grow both summer savory and winter savory. And thyme, I think everybody's familiar with. It's another good one to grow as a edible ground cover. As a cook, I always remember the herbal rule of thumb that when in doubt, use thyme. But thyme can be very difficult to harvest because the leaves are so small. So kind of like this little apparatus is called an herb stripper. You can find it by Sheffin, which has a really nice website and has not only this herb implement, but several other things that you can use for harvesting and processing herbs. You can just run the stem of the thyme through this and collect the leaves in the little bowl. Coriander, the Spanish is cilantro. It's important to understand that only Americans and Mexicans use the term cilantro. The rest of the world talks about the leaves as fresh coriander, coriander leaves. Sometimes you'll see the term Chinese parsley. And of course, this is a plant that we use both the leaves as an herb and we use the seeds as a spice. I usually don't grow my own coriander because it bolts and goes to seed very quickly. So if you want a source of cilantro or fresh coriander throughout the summer and into the fall, you're going to have to do plantings about every 2 or 3 weeks. So you have a continuous supply. And to me, I don't use it that much, or like I did this year, make a pesto out of it. So whenever I want fresh coriander, just use one of my frozen pesto coriander cubes. All right, we're going to finish up with what I call the flowering herbs. The first one is chamomile. I was exposed to chamomile as a young child through the stories of Peter Rabbit. When Peter Rabbit got into Mr. Gregor's garden and overate, he had an upset tummy, and his mom gave him chamomile tea. Chamomile comes from the Greek word meaning ground or earth apple. Some of the varieties can have an appleish type aroma and flavor. It's the dried flower heads that are made into tea. The medicinal properties in chamomile are primarily in the essential oils, and many of those are lost in the drying process. So chamomile tea is probably not the best way to get the medicinal properties from chamomile. It can be a little bit confusing because there are a number of different species that are actually in different genuses. They're all in the same composite family, but there's a group of chamomile called German wild or blue chamomile and another group called Roman chamomile. The dried flower heads can be used for tea and other medicinal properties and do make a beautiful flowering plant.
One question is, can you use the leaves of the chamomile plant or do you just use the flowers?
Good question. I would have to look up more extensively about using the leaves. I've only seen reference to using the flowers. So I would have to do some more research to see if the leaves are edible as well. Most of the resources talk about using the flowers. Tansy is an interesting herb. It's not really one that we use for culinary purposes. It's sometimes called ant fern, and you can see in the picture on the right that the leaves look like fern-like leaves. It has been used in the past as an insect repellent. Before there were screens in windows, you could hang it in the window to repel insects. You could also place it around your kitchen to repel ants from coming into your kitchen. And it's also what's called a strewing herb, which is sort of unique. In Britain, the very first royal herb strewer was identified in the 1600s. And I like this quote: "It was the garnisher and trimmer of the chapel presence and the privy lodgings," meaning that tansy, along with some other herbs, was strewn on the floor, and when you walked across it, it would release pleasant aromas that would be nice to find. Calendula, sometimes called pot marigold. It's not really related to other marigolds or what we consider to be the common marigold. This is a good example of an edible flower. It can be edible as a fresh flower, or it can be dried and then ground up into a yellow powder and sometimes called poor man's saffron. So it's much less expensive than saffron. You would use it in the same way. Again, a beautiful flowering herb. I like to have that in my herb garden just for the flowers. And then finally, stevia, that we're probably all familiar with, sometimes called sweet herb, candy leaf, or sugar leaf. The compounds in stevia are somewhere between 30 and 40 times sweeter than sucrose. This is a fun one to grow and share with children, especially, or even adults, and give them a leaf to chew on. It has a very nice sweet flavor. So anywhere where you want low calorie or no calorie sweetness, whether it be in a drink or some other food item, stevia is easy to grow. It's flowering right now in our demonstration garden, so it's a nice flowering herb that also has a culinary use. So how to use culinary herbs. We're not going to have time today to go into details, but I'll give you a couple of references about using these in a culinary way. We can certainly use them fresh or dried. That's the traditional way. If you're using them from cooking, we generally say if you're using fresh herbs, you need to use about 2 to 3 times larger quantity than if you use the exact same herb dried. Freezing, blanch and freeze is a good way to preserve basil. I'll briefly mention pestos and then send you to the handout that has quite a bit more information about making a variety of pestos, which is the way I like to use the herbs throughout the year. I've got information about making herb-infused vinegars, oils, and butters, and then finally teas. All the information about those and all the recipes are in the Gardening and Cooking with Herbs handout that's listed in the chat box. So I would encourage you to print that out. Again, it's a pretty long set of notes. It's about 19 or 20 pages long, and the 8 or 9 pages have all the details. And I've also done a video, and the video link is in the chat box, and you can find it on the Buncombe County Extension website as well. So I've gone through in a video made with a PowerPoint presentation, all the details that we don't have time to go through today. But real quickly about pestos, because this is one of my preferred ways of using culinary herbs. Everybody thinks of traditional pesto as only being Italian pesto or pesto Genovese, which is basically basil and garlic and pine nuts and olive oil. But pesto comes from the Italian word pastare, which means to pound, because traditionally the pestos were made with a mortar and pestle. But today with modern food processors, it's very easy and you can do it very quickly. You can do it in a blender. You just need to chop up the materials. So if you just take a food processor, put all the ingredients in there. And again, I've given you the recipes for probably a dozen different types of pestos. Just put it in the food presser, pulse it until you get a material that looks like finely chopped grass. And then you just drizzle in whatever oil you want to use, olive oil or some other oil. Just drizzle in enough oil to make it either a paste or make a consistency to form it into balls. I like to use cookie dough scoops. You can get those in different sizes. And I show you a picture here of the pestos that I made earlier this year. So just use the cookie scoop to make little balls, and these can be whatever size you want. Put those on wax paper on a cookie sheet, put those in your freezer for about 24 hours, and then retrieve those, and they'll be frozen nice and hard. Put those in a Ziploc bag or some other closed container, and they will last for 6 to 12 months. And anytime you want an herb, just pull one of those. My wife and I call them herb cubes. Just pull those out of the freezer. You can even cut them in half if you want a smaller quantity. I think this is the best, easiest way to use herbs throughout the year.
Can you make pesto without oil?
Good question. Most of the pesto recipes do call for some type of nut. If you can afford pine nuts, that's what's in kind of traditional basil pesto. I have a tendency to start with slivered almonds. The use of nuts is for 2 purposes. One is obviously to have that nut as part of the pesto. Secondly, if you're using a food processor, it provides a little bit of grit against which the blades can grind up the leafy herbs. If you don't want to have nuts for that particular purpose, then you can use crushed ice. So just use a little bit of ice. Again, that kind of gives grit. And of course, that additional moisture isn't too bad. Not using oil, I guess you would just have to use water. Basically, you want to make it into a paste that you can form into a ball. And I guess you could do it with water, but I've never tried that. So good question. So let me stop there. For other culinary tips, I would encourage you to look at the notes in the handout, look at the video. Those are listed in the chat box, or you can find those at the extension site. They will give you more details about how to make each of these items for culinary use.
Well, that's it. So I'd like to thank you, Phil, for all of this information you've given us on herbs. You've given me inspiration to make some pesto pasta this weekend. Thank you all for attending, and happy herb gardening. Bye-bye, everyone.